Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with another watch review, and today we're having a look at the Omega Seamaster Planet Ocean 600. So Omega have been making dive watches since 1932 when they released the Omega Marine, and that was the first of commercially available dive watch. And then later on in 1957 they released the iconic Seamaster 300. And then in 2005 is when we saw the introduction of the Planet Ocean series. And it was introduced in the collection, the Omega Seamaster collection, as a better version or a more advanced professional version than the 300. Obviously featuring a greater dive depth or double the dive depth to 600 meters versus 300 meters, featured a bigger case because of that, and a few more advanced features like helium escape valves, etc, etc. Moving on to 2011, the watch received a few updates. One of those was a clear crystal case back, which is a really nice feature for us to be able to see the movement inside. And it also got a new ceramic bezel and a few changes to the movement as well. And then in 2016, the watch received another update, which featured a slightly different case, which is the watch we're looking at now. And it also featured changes to the movement. And that movement has become quite an iconic movement, the caliber 8500. And that movement features some of the highest resistance to magnetic fields out of all watches available in the Swiss watch industry. It was seen as a real feat in terms of watchmaking to create a watch that was that resistive. So that concludes the history of the watch, or the basic history of this watch. Let's have a look at some of the features of this piece. So we'll start from the clasp. The clasp is the Omega Seamaster clasp. I think it's the same clasp that we've seen on the Speedmaster as well, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it's pretty standard Omega clasp. It is very, very good. It feels very well machined, and emphasis on that word machined. It really does feel like a utility clasp, like it's there to do a purpose. It's not necessarily to look pretty or nice. It also features a system that's quite similar to Rolex's Easy Link system, where you can open up the bracelet by a few mil, whereas this actually opens up the bracelet by quite a lot, and it's kind of like an easy access for you when you're wearing a watch and you want to make it bigger. It's specifically designed on this watch for wetsuits, so you can then wear the watch normally and then put it over the top of a wetsuit without having to add links on. It actually extends the bracelet quite considerably, and in my opinion maybe too much. When you look at the Easy Link ones, that only extends it by 5 mil. This seems to extend it by what looks like pretty much an inch, which is quite a lot. Whether or not, well, I'm sure they've done their calculations, and maybe on average the dive suits that people wear will actually add that much to a wrist circumference, but that's what they've done, and there's no sort of middle ground. You either have that inch out or you have just your standard bracelet. Moving now onto the bracelet, it's a brushed sort of satin finish. It's not really designed to look pretty or elegant or like jewelry. It's purely there to be a nice utility bracelet that is not really going to fail you. It feels quite solid. It is very, very light because this watch is a titanium watch. The bracelet and the case do feel very light, and for that reason it does feel a little bit tinny or not cheap, but it doesn't feel as solid as some of the Rolexes, but obviously they'd be in steel, so it's a different story there. It is more comfortable probably than a Rolex bracelet because it has so many little smaller links, and they're rounded as well, which means the contact between your wrist and the actual bracelet is kept to a minimal amount, which means it should be in theory more comfortable. And the fact that it's got a greater number of links per sort of area of the bracelet means that it should conform to your wrist better as well than a oyster bracelet that we see on the Rolexes. Moving now onto the case, we've got a full titanium case and bezel. We have polished accents on the sides of the watch, and we've also got brushed accents as well. The case itself is actually very similar to the Speedmaster case. It's quite a standard Omega case. I think it is really nice. It's slightly different to the Seamaster, the regular Seamaster 300 case, and in a way I prefer this because it reminds me more of their vintage watches. They're kind of, well, it's a Speedmaster obviously for me, but those older style watches and that sort of classic Omega look with the polished and the satin, and that kind of way the lugs swoop round, the polished accent swoops round the lug. I really like that. It has got a kind of retro look to the watch. And then at 10 o'clock we've got our helium escape valve, and then at 3 o'clock we've got our crown. Moving on to the bezel, we've got a unidirectional bezel, which means that it can only rotate in one direction, which is obviously very important for diving. You don't want to accidentally knock your bezel when you're underwater and then add on time to your dive when actually you don't have that much time in your tanks. So it's a smart move because it means you can only reduce your dive time rather than adding on time. The rotating bezel doesn't feel as solid as some of the Rolex rotating bezels, but it's got a different feel. It feels more lighter, it definitely feels more easier to move. The Rolex ones are much more stiffer. They feel more oiled and kind of buttery the way you move them. They kind of glide around, whereas this is much more like tick, 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 tick. The bezel is actually made from ceramic, and then the numbers on top of the bezel are using their liquid metal technology. So they essentially take their bezels and heat them to really high temperatures to make them extremely hard and tough. And then they use a laser to etch out the markings on the dial, so like the different markings for your decompression stops and your actual numbers. And once they've etched out a channel that's deep enough for each part of the numbers and indexes, they then squish their liquid metal over the top of the bezel, which means that all the metal squishes into those grooves that the lasers created, and then they cut the rest off and polish it, and then it creates this seamless finish between the ceramic and then the metal. And obviously with the bezel being ceramic, it shouldn't fade over time in terms of color, and it shouldn't scratch very easily either. Now moving on to the dial, we've got this really nice blue dial to match the bezel. We've got those vintage style hands, those retro hands, which are those big oversized arrows. I think they look really cool. It does look a little bit like a toy watch in a way because of those hands and those oversized indexes around the dial, but I do quite like that look. I think it does, harks back to those original Seamasters, and I think that is a nice feature for them to add that same little touch, a retro touch, and a nod to those original designs to the Planet Ocean, which is seen as their ultimate dive, or one of their ultimate dive watches. The date window is really nice and subtle. The dive is a dive watch at the end of the day, so it is all about just being able to tell the time very, very clearly on your bezel and your dial. So the date should be a sort of a back feature, something you're not necessarily that bothered about during diving. It's nice that once you finish your dive in the evening, you can then, you've got your date function there if you need it. One thing that I would say that's probably not my favorite thing about this is the bezel is actually quite difficult to read, and I can imagine if you are underwater where the light level is not very good, I think this bezel would probably be quite hard to read the numbers and the indexes. If you catch it in certain light, they do really pop out. The metal pops out from the ceramic, but most of the time it does really sort of blend into one color, and I think that's maybe a poor decision because the Submariners and the Sea Dwellers from Rolex are very, very legible, and the Ploprof that I reviewed a while ago from Omega is much more legible than this. I think you may, in certain light and certain circumstances, have trouble actually reading that bezel, which kind of defeats the point of it being a dive watch. It should be extremely legible, and you should just be able to have a quick glance at the watch and know exactly how much longer you've got underwater. A little touch on the Helium escape valve we've got here at 10 o'clock. I misinformed everyone on my Ploprof video about what they actually do. The reason they have these on watches is not because, like I said in the previous video, that you dive to very deep depths and helium can enter inside the watch. The actual reason is for saturation divers. The feature is designed for saturation diving. Saturation diving is basically when divers that are working at very, very low depths, instead of resurfacing each time, they actually stay underwater in special chambers, almost like stationary submarines that live on the sea floor. And inside these tanks, these chambers, there is a little bit of helium in the air in order to counteract the effects of the nitrogen that they breathe during the day, etc., etc. They're much smaller than most molecules, helium molecules, and that means that they can sometimes find their way inside watch movements or watch cases, because they can get past the gaskets, the rubber gaskets, and find their way in. So divers were finding that when they resurfaced, their watches or their watch crystal would explode because all the helium that was stuck inside there was difference in pressure, and the helium wanted to escape. So watchmakers came up with a solution to have this little valve here that only allows helium out, it doesn't let anything in. And it just means that you can unscrew this when you get to the surface or on your way up, and it allows the helium to slowly escape through that valve. Coming on to the crystal now, at the top of the watch, we have this domed sapphire crystal, which is quite hard to achieve with sapphire. It's usually very difficult to make unusual shapes or rounded shapes with sapphire. It usually only stays in a flat shape, or it's easier to machine in flat shapes. I really like the domed effect. It creates this really cool effect when you angle it at an extreme angle. It reminds me of the sea, you know, using goggles and things like that, and kind of looks like the surface of the ocean if you were to turn it upside down. When you look at the surface of the water from below, it has this kind of diffraction effect. It looks really cool. And then quickly turning over the watch, we have a clear crystal case back so you can see inside the movement. The movement is obviously not finished to a high level, it's just machine finished, but I quite like the machine finish. You know, you really do notice it is a utility watch, and it is very much a tool, and the movement reflects that. It does look like a tool movement. The actual watch itself is 45.5 mil across the case diameter, so it is a very, very big watch, and it's also very, very deep as well. It's obviously useful having a big chunky watch when you're diving, firstly because it's extremely legible when it's larger, and also it has to be able to withstand that sort of pressure. So 600 meters is a very, very low depth, 60 bars. The reason why they use titanium over steel for this watch is because titanium actually has one of the highest strength to density ratios. So it's extremely strong, hard metal, but it's actually very, very light. It's not very dense. So it means it's nice and light when you're wearing it, but it's also still going to keep the same strength that other metals have as well. That's obviously nice and useful for a diver who doesn't want to have a really heavy weight on their wrist while they're trying to work underwater. They want to be able to just have something that's going to be able to kind of, you wouldn't even notice it be there. Titanium also has a very high resistance to corrosion, which is obviously useful if your watch is constantly going underwater and through the harsh environments of the sea. Would I own this watch? Probably not, because it is way too big for me, and you know, it's a very specialist dive tool. It's something that probably no one, or very, very few people who actually buy this watch will use it in a saturation dive, but it's really cool to know that it can do that, and it's amazing watchmaking and engineering from Omega to be able to create a watch that can go to that sort of extreme depth and that extreme environment. I think for people who love diving and love Omega, I think this is an amazing watch. And I think people will appreciate what Omega have created here and the history behind the Seamaster and what they've done in the past. I think this is a really nice addition to the collection. I really like the blue on the bezel and the dial, and I like the kind of darker look of titanium as well. A little quick side note that I'd like to mention as well, something that I don't often mention in watch reviews, is actually the boxes and the presentation. Omega usually does present watches really, really nicely. Actually, probably one of the best out of all the Swiss watch brands. Patek is very, very nice. Their boxes are really nice, but they don't change the boxes very much between watches, whereas Omega pretty much always changes the watch box to match the watch. And they always have a really nice, unique looking watch box. And this one is no exception. It is finished absolutely beautifully, just as nicely as the watch. Even the screws in the box are aligned. And that's a little note to Hublot, if you're listening, take note from Omega. They managed to align their screws on their boxes, so there's not really an excuse why you can't align your screws on your bezels. The kind of finish on the box is very, very, very high end. It really is a luxury addition to your watch. And it reminds me of a yacht, and they really have thought about how they can make it a luxury experience, not just, you know, a utility watch. They could have just taken, like Rolex does, a very, very simple, boring watch box for a utility watch, but in fact they went above and beyond to make something feel very much more luxurious than just a tool. Thanks guys for watching. Let us know what you think of this Planet Ocean. Would you own a Planet Ocean? Would you maybe own another Seamaster from the Omega collection? Or maybe you'd own a completely different dive watch, not from Omega? Let us know in the comments.